The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Mackenzie adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that day. At 24 years old, he had been serving as one of the Queen's Guard for nearly 3 years, but the weight of his bearskin hat still felt foreign on his head. The thick black fur, standing nearly 18 inches tall, was a symbol of honor and tradition that dated back centuries, yet Thomas sometimes wondered if the tourists who gathered daily truly understood the significance of what they were witnessing. The year was 1987, and the world seemed to be changing at lightning speed. Margaret Thatcher was reshaping Britain's political landscape, the Cold War tensions were slowly beginning to thaw, and technology was advancing in ways that seemed almost magical to those who remembered life before computers. Yet here, in this ancient courtyard, time moved differently. The traditions remained unchanged, the protocols were as rigid as ever, and the expectations placed upon the guards were absolute. Thomas had grown up in a small village in Yorkshire, where his father worked as a blacksmith and his mother tended to their modest garden. The idea of serving the crown had never crossed his mind until a military recruiter visited his secondary school during his final year. The man spoke of honor, duty, and the chance to see the world while serving something greater than oneself. For a young man from a working-class family with limited prospects, the opportunity seemed too good to pass up. The training had been brutal. Months of physical conditioning, weapons training, and endless drilling and ceremonial procedures had transformed the lanky farm boy into a disciplined soldier. But nothing had quite prepared him for the reality of standing motionless for hours at a time while crowds of curious onlookers gathered around him, treating him more like a statue than a human being. On this particular Tuesday morning, Thomas had taken his position at the main gate at precisely 6 o'clock. The changing of the guard ceremony wouldn't begin for another 4 hours, but his duty was to maintain watch over the palace grounds and ensure that no unauthorized individuals attempted to breach the perimeter. It was a responsibility he took seriously, despite the monotony that often accompanied the role. The first tourists began arriving around 8 o'clock, just as they did every morning. They came in small groups at first, mostly elderly couples with cameras hanging around their necks and guidebooks clutched in their hands. Thomas had learned to recognize the different types of visitors over his years of service. There were the respectful observers who maintained a proper distance and spoke in hushed tones. There were the enthusiastic families with young children who pointed and whispered excitedly about the toy soldiers. And then, there were the troublemakers who seemed to view the guards as entertainment, testing the limits of what they could get away with. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew larger and more diverse. Tour groups led by guides with colorful umbrellas and portable microphones began to arrive, followed by individual travelers who wandered around with an air of casual curiosity. Thomas remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead, his breathing controlled and steady. Years of training had taught him to be aware of everything happening around him without appearing to notice anything at all. The palace horses were scheduled for their morning exercise at 10:30, and Thomas could hear the stable hands preparing them in the distance. The sound of hooves on cobblestones and the gentle nickering of the animals always brought a sense of life to the otherwise formal atmosphere of the palace grounds. These weren't ordinary horses, they were carefully bred and trained animals that had been selected specifically for their temperament and ability to remain calm in crowded, noisy environments. Among the horses being prepared that morning was Wellington, a magnificent bay gelding with a glossy coat and intelligent eyes. At 8 years old, Wellington had served in numerous ceremonial events and had developed something of a reputation among the stable staff for his gentle nature and remarkable intelligence. Unlike some of the other horses who could be skittish around crowds, Wellington seemed to enjoy the attention and would often acknowledge spectators with a slight toss of his head or a soft whinny. The head groom, Margaret Foster, had been working with the palace horses for over 15 years and knew each animal's personality as well as she knew her own children. She had a particular fondness for Wellington, whom she had helped train from the time he was a young colt. Margaret was a woman of few words but infinite patience, and her ability to communicate with the horses was legendary among the palace staff. As she led Wellington out into the courtyard for his morning routine, Margaret noticed that the crowd was larger than usual. A school group from France had arrived earlier than expected, and their excited chatter filled the air. The children, probably around 10 or 11 years old, pressed against the barriers with wide eyes and animated gestures, clearly thrilled to be witnessing such a spectacle.
Wellington seemed unbothered by the commotion.
If anything, he appeared to enjoy being the center of attention. He walked with a proud gait, his head held high and his ears perked forward with interest. Margaret guided him through the basic exercises that were part of his daily routine, checking his responsiveness to commands and ensuring that he was in good condition for any ceremonial duties that might arise during the day. Thomas watched the interaction between Margaret and Wellington from his post, admiring the seamless communication between human and animal. It reminded him of his childhood on the farm, where he had helped care for his father's draft horses. Those had been simpler times, when his biggest worry was whether the weather would cooperate for the harvest, and his greatest ambition was to someday take over his father's business. The crowd continued to grow as the morning wore on, and with it came an increasing level of noise and activity. Tour guides competed for attention, cameras clicked constantly, and conversations in a dozen different languages created a babble of sounds that echoed off the palace walls. Through it all, Thomas remained at his post, a silent sentinel maintaining his vigil over the royal grounds. It was approaching 11 o'clock when Thomas first noticed the man who would later play such a significant role in the day's events. He was tall and well-dressed, wearing an expensive-looking overcoat and carrying himself with an air of authority that suggested he was accustomed to being in charge. Unlike the other tourists who seemed content to observe from a distance, this man had positioned himself near the front of the crowd and was studying the proceedings with an intensity that seemed almost calculating. The man appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp features that gave him a distinguished appearance. He carried no camera and held no guidebook, instead focusing his attention entirely on the guards and their routines. Thomas, trained to notice potential security threats, made a mental note of the man's presence while continuing to maintain his professional demeanor. As Wellington and Margaret completed their morning exercises, the distinguished-looking visitor began to move closer to where Thomas was stationed. His movements were deliberate and confident, suggesting that he was familiar with the palace protocols and knew exactly how far he could advance without crossing any official boundaries. The crowd had grown quite dense by this time, with people jostling for better viewing positions and children being lifted onto their parents' shoulders for a clearer view. The combination of excitement and confusion that typically accompanied large gatherings was beginning to build, and Thomas could sense the subtle shift in atmosphere that often preceded some kind of incident. Margaret was leading Wellington back toward the stable area when the distinguished visitor made his move. With a smooth, practiced motion, he stepped forward and addressed Thomas directly, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite the ambient noise from the crowd. "I say, guard," the man called out, his accent clearly indicating upper-class British origins. "Might I have a word with you about proper protocol?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Thomas felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward him. This was the moment that every guard dreaded and prepared for simultaneously. The protocols were clear: guards on duty were not to engage in conversation with members of the public under any circumstances. They were to remain silent, motionless, and focused on their duties regardless of provocation or attempted interaction. Yet something about this particular situation felt different. The man's tone was not mocking or disrespectful like that of the typical troublemaker. Instead, it carried an air of genuine authority, as if he had every right to expect a response. Thomas found himself caught between his training and his instinct that this was no ordinary tourist trying to get a reaction. The crowd had fallen silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even the French schoolchildren had stopped their chatter, their young faces turned toward the unfolding drama with rapt attention. Margaret had paused in her progress toward the stables, Wellington's reins still in her hand, as she too became aware of the tension that was building in the courtyard. For Thomas, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Every second stretched into an eternity as he wrestled with the decision of how to respond. His training screamed at him to maintain his silence and ignore the man's words completely. The regulations were clear and unambiguous: guards on ceremonial duty were not to acknowledge or respond to attempts at communication from the public. But there was something about the man's demeanor and the way he had phrased his request that suggested this was more than a simple attempt to get a reaction. The reference to proper protocol implied that the speaker had some knowledge of military procedures and, perhaps even some authority to question them. Thomas found himself wondering if this might be some kind of test or inspection that he had not been warned about. The silence stretched on, becoming more oppressive with each passing moment.
The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Thomas could feel sweat beginning to form beneath his heavy uniform despite the cool morning air. His heart rate had increased, though his external appearance remained as stoic and controlled as ever. Wellington, perhaps sensing the tension in the air, began to shift restlessly. The intelligent horse's ears swiveled back and forth as he tried to understand what was happening around him. Margaret gently stroked his neck, whispering soft words of reassurance while keeping her own attention focused on the confrontation that was developing between Thomas and the mysterious visitor. The man stood waiting for a response with the patience of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His posture was relaxed but alert, and his eyes never left Thomas's face despite the guard's best efforts to avoid direct eye contact. It was clear that he was not going to simply give up and walk away like most tourists did when their attempts at interaction were ignored. Thomas realized that he was facing a situation that his training had not adequately prepared him for. While he had practiced dealing with various types of disruptions and provocations, nothing had quite prepared him for this kind of polite but insistent challenge to his authority and protocol. The man was not being disrespectful or disruptive in any obvious way, yet his very presence and his words had created a tension that was palpable throughout the courtyard. As the standoff continued, Thomas became increasingly aware that his response, or lack thereof, was being watched and evaluated by everyone present. The tourists were witnessing what they probably assumed was just another example of the famous stoicism of the Queen's Guard, but Thomas knew that the situation was far more complex and potentially problematic than it appeared on the surface. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and its rays were beginning to warm the stone surfaces of the courtyard. The shadows that had been so pronounced earlier were growing shorter and less defined, but the shadow cast by this unexpected confrontation seemed to be growing longer with each passing moment. Thomas found himself wishing that the changing of the guard ceremony would begin early, providing him with a legitimate reason to move from his position and end this uncomfortable standoff. But there were still more than 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, and he was expected to maintain his post regardless of whatever challenges might arise. This was the essence of being a Queen's Guard, the ability to remain steadfast and unwavering in the face of any situation, no matter how unexpected or uncomfortable it might be. The distinguished visitor showed no signs of growing impatient or giving up. If anything, he seemed to be settling in for a long wait, as if he had all the time in the world to see how this situation would resolve itself. His confidence was unsettling, and Thomas began to wonder if perhaps this man did indeed have some authority that he was not immediately apparent. As the minutes ticked by, the crowd began to show signs of restlessness. Some tourists moved on to other areas of the palace grounds, but many remained, apparently fascinated by the silent drama playing out before them. The French schoolchildren, in particular, seemed captivated by the standoff, whispering among themselves in excited tones about what they were witnessing. Wellington had grown tired of standing still and was beginning to show signs of wanting to return to his stable. Margaret continued to hold his reins patiently, but Thomas could see that she was growing concerned about the delay in their routine. The horses were creatures of habit, and any deviation from their expected schedule could cause them to become anxious or unpredictable. The sound of footsteps on cobblestones caught Thomas's attention, and he realized that other palace staff members were beginning to take notice of the situation. Without moving his head or changing his expression, he used his peripheral vision to observe several uniformed security personnel who had positioned themselves at strategic points around the courtyard. Their presence was subtle but unmistakable, and it was clear that they were prepared to intervene if the situation escalated. This realization brought both relief and additional pressure to Thomas. On one hand, he knew that help was available if he needed it. On the other hand, the presence of security personnel suggested that his superiors were aware of what was happening and were watching to see how he would handle the situation. His performance in this moment could have significant implications for his career and his standing within the regiment. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Thomas's shoulders as he continued to maintain his position and his silence. Every instinct told him that this was not a typical tourist encounter, but he still had no clear indication of how he should respond. The protocols that had been drilled into him during training seemed inadequate for dealing with this particular situation, yet he knew that any deviation from those protocols could result in serious disciplinary action. As the standoff entered its second hour,
Thomas began to realize that this was likely to be a defining moment in his military career. The outcome of this encounter would be remembered and discussed long after the day was over, and his handling of it would become part of his permanent record. The pressure to make the right decision was enormous, yet the correct course of action remained frustratingly unclear. The man continued to wait with remarkable patience, his presence serving as a constant reminder of the challenge that had been issued. His calm confidence suggested that he was certain his question deserved an answer, and his willingness to wait indefinitely indicated that he was not going to be deterred by the traditional tactics of ignoring unwanted attention. Thomas found himself studying the man's face more carefully, trying to detect any clues about his identity or intentions. There was something familiar about his features, though Thomas could not quite place where he might have seen him before. The possibility that this was someone of importance who should be recognized began to gnaw at the edges of his consciousness, adding another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. As noon approached and the courtyard filled with even more visitors, Thomas realized that whatever decision he made would have to be made soon. The changing of the guard ceremony would begin in less than 2 hours, and the situation needed to be resolved before then. The question was no longer whether he would respond to the man's challenge, but how he would respond and what the consequences of that response might be. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Thomas had learned about duty, protocol, and the sometimes conflicting demands of military service. The words that had frozen the courtyard continued to hang in the air, waiting for a response that would determine not only the outcome of this particular encounter but potentially the future course of several lives. The royal standoff had begun, and there was no turning back. The clock tower of nearby Westminster began its deep, resonant chime marking the noon hour, and still Thomas Mackenzie stood frozen in his impossible position. The distinguished gentleman remained exactly where he had been for nearly an hour, showing no signs of impatience or intention to move along like any reasonable tourist would have done by now. The crowd had changed around them, with some people leaving and others arriving, but the core group of spectators seemed mesmerized by the silent battle of wills taking place before their eyes. Thomas could feel moisture gathering inside his heavy bearskin hat, and the wool of his red tunic was beginning to feel uncomfortably warm despite the cool October air. His legs, trained though they were for long periods of standing, were starting to protest the extended motionless stance. But, more troubling than any physical discomfort was the growing realization that this situation was spiraling beyond anything his training had prepared him for. Margaret Foster had been watching the standoff with increasing concern. Wellington was growing restless beside her, occasionally pawing at the cobblestones and tossing his magnificent head. The horse's usual calm demeanor was being tested by the unusual tension in the air and the delay in returning to his stable for his midday meal. Margaret knew horses well enough to recognize that Wellington was picking up on the human emotions surrounding him, and she worried that the situation might escalate in ways that could endanger both the animal and the gathered crowd. The French school group had been joined by what appeared to be a class from Germany, and the excited chatter of children in multiple languages created a constant background hum. Their teachers were trying to maintain order while simultaneously craning their necks to get a better view of what everyone was calling the statue man who won't talk. Some of the children had begun placing small bets on whether the guard would eventually speak or move, turning the solemn ceremony of royal protocol into an impromptu game. Detective Inspector James Crawford of the Metropolitan Police had been quietly observing the situation from his position near the palace's main security checkpoint. A veteran of 15 years on the force, Crawford had seen his share of unusual incidents around the royal properties, but this one had caught his attention for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. Something about the well-dressed man's confidence and the way he carried himself suggested this wasn't just another tourist trying to get a reaction from the guards. Crawford had run a discreet check on the man through the security cameras and facial recognition systems, but had come up empty. Whoever this person was, he wasn't in any of the databases that Crawford had access to, which was itself somewhat unusual. Most troublemakers around the palace were repeat offenders who appeared in the system multiple times. The absence of any record suggested either a first-time visitor or someone important enough to keep their information restricted. Inside the palace, word of the unusual standoff had reached the ears of Colonel James Whitmore, the commanding officer responsible for the ceremonial guards. Whitmore was a career military man who had served with distinction in Northern Ireland and the Falklands before accepting his current position. He was known for his strict adherence to protocol and his unwillingness to tolerate any deviation from established procedures. When his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, first briefed him on the situation, Whitmore's initial reaction was dismissive. Guards dealt with difficult tourists on a regular basis, and maintaining composure in the face of provocation was fundamental to their training. But, as the reports continued to come in describing the extended duration of the encounter and the growing crowd of spectators, Whitmore began to realize that this was developing into something more significant than a routine disruption. The colonel made his way to one of the palace's observation windows that provided a clear view of the courtyard. Through his military-issue binoculars, he could see Thomas maintaining his position with admirable discipline, but he could also observe the subtle signs of strain that would be invisible to civilian observers. The slight tenseness around the guard's eyes, the barely perceptible shift in his breathing pattern, and the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands all told Whitmore that his soldier was under considerable stress. More concerning was the identity of the challenger. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about the man's bearing and appearance. Whitmore had attended countless military and diplomatic functions during his career, and he prided himself on his ability to remember faces. The nagging sense that he should recognize this person was troubling, particularly given the man's apparent knowledge of military protocol and his confident expectation that his challenge would be answered. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a behavioral psychologist who consulted regularly with the palace security team, happened to be on the grounds conducting a routine assessment of guard training procedures. She had been observing various posts when the standoff began, and her professional interest was immediately piqued by the psychological dynamics at play. From her perspective, both men were locked in a complex power struggle that went far beyond the simple question of whether a guard should respond to a tourist's inquiry. The challenger's calm persistence suggested someone accustomed to having his authority respected, while Thomas's disciplined silence demonstrated the kind of institutional loyalty that military training was designed to instill. The prolonged nature of the encounter was creating a feedback loop where neither participant could back down without losing face. Dr. Hartwell noted with interest how the growing crowd was affecting the dynamic. What had begun as a private test of wills had become a very public performance, with hundreds of witnesses watching to see how the drama would unfold. This transformation from private encounter to public spectacle had raised the stakes considerably for both participants, making it even more difficult for either one to find a graceful way to disengage. The lunch hour had brought an influx of office workers and local residents who often used their break time to walk through the palace grounds. Many of them were regulars who had seen the guards countless times before, and they immediately recognized that something unusual was happening. Word began to spread through the crowd that one of the guards was involved in some kind of standoff, and people began pulling out cameras and phones to document what they assumed would eventually become a newsworthy incident. Among the growing throng of spectators was Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, an elderly widow who had been visiting the palace grounds almost daily for the past 5 years. At 78 years old, she had become something of a fixture around the area, and many of the regular guards knew her by sight if not by name. Mrs. Pemberton had a keen eye for detail and an excellent memory, qualities that had served her well during her decades as a primary school teacher before her retirement. As she observed the standoff, Mrs. Pemberton found herself studying the well-dressed challenger with particular interest. There was definitely something familiar about him, though she couldn't immediately place where she might have seen him before. His posture, his manner of dress, even the way he held his hands while waiting, all suggested someone of considerable importance and breeding. She began mentally reviewing the various official functions and ceremonies she had witnessed over the years, trying to match his face with her memories. Wellington was becoming increasingly agitated, and Margaret Foster was growing genuinely concerned about the horse's well-being. The intelligent animal had clearly sensed that something was wrong, and his usual calm demeanor was giving way to nervous energy that manifested in constant head movements and occasional soft whinnies. Margaret knew that if the situation continued much longer, she would need to make the difficult decision to remove Wellington from the area, potentially disrupting the afternoon ceremonial schedule. The horse's distress was not lost on Thomas, who had developed a fondness for Wellington during his years of service. Many times, the guard had watched Margaret working with the various horses, and he had come to appreciate the unique relationship between the grooms and their charges. Seeing Wellington in distress added another layer of pressure to an already overwhelming situation. Detective Inspector Crawford had moved closer to the scene while maintaining his surveillance of the Challenger. His trained eye continued to pick up details that suggested this was no ordinary tourist. The man's shoes were expensive Italian leather, his watch appeared to be a luxury Swiss timepiece, and his overcoat bore the subtle markings of Seville Row tailoring. More importantly, his posture and bearing suggested military training, though of a vintage that placed him in an older generation than the current guards. Crawford's radio crackled with periodic updates from other security personnel positioned around the palace grounds. The situation was being monitored at the highest levels, and there was growing pressure to resolve it before it attracted media attention or posed any risk to public safety. The detective found himself caught between his professional instinct to intervene and his recognition that this appeared to be a matter of military protocol rather than civilian law enforcement. Inside the Security Command Center, technicians were reviewing camera footage from earlier in the morning to trace the Challenger's arrival and movements. The high-definition surveillance system had captured him entering the palace grounds through the main public entrance at approximately 9:15 a.m., but there was nothing in his behavior or appearance at that time to suggest he was planning anything disruptive. The footage showed him moving through the grounds in a purposeful but unhurried manner, pausing occasionally to observe various aspects of the palace's operations. His route had taken him past several other guard positions, but he had shown no interest in engaging with any of those personnel. It was only when he reached Thomas's post that he had positioned himself for what appeared to be a carefully planned confrontation. Technical analysis of the man's movements suggested familiarity with the palace layout that went beyond what a typical tourist would possess. His navigation of the grounds was too efficient and direct to be the result of casual exploration. Someone had briefed him on the optimal viewing positions and the timing of various ceremonial activities, or he possessed that knowledge from previous experience. Colonel Whitmore had reached a decision point. The situation had been ongoing for nearly 2 hours, and the afternoon changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 60 minutes. If the standoff continued, it would inevitably disrupt the carefully choreographed routine that thousands of tourists came to witness daily. More concerning was the growing crowd and the increasing likelihood that media representatives would arrive to cover what was becoming an unusual story. The colonel's military experience had taught him that sometimes the best way to resolve a confrontation was to change the parameters entirely. Rather than allowing the situation to continue on its current trajectory, he began considering options that would allow both participants to maintain their dignity while bringing the standoff to a conclusion. Lieutenant Morrison received orders to discreetly contact the senior non-commissioned officer responsible for the guard rotation and begin preparing contingency plans. These included the possibility of an early changing of the guard, the deployment of additional security personnel, or the implementation of crowd control measures if the situation continued to escalate. Dr. Hartwell continued her psychological observation of the key participants, noting subtle changes in their behavior as the standoff entered its third hour. Thomas was showing signs of increasing fatigue, though his military discipline was keeping these symptoms largely invisible to casual observers. The Challenger, by contrast, appeared to be growing more confident and determined, as if the guard's continued silence was confirming his expectations rather than frustrating his intentions. The crowd dynamics were also evolving in interesting ways. What had begun as casual curiosity was transforming into a more organized spectacle, with some people clearly planning to remain until the situation reached some kind of resolution. Food vendors from nearby streets had begun positioning themselves to serve the growing crowd, and someone had started an impromptu betting pool on the eventual outcome. Mrs. Pemberton's persistence in trying to identify the Challenger finally paid off when a particular angle of afternoon sunlight illuminated his profile in a way that triggered a clear memory. She remembered now where she had seen him before. It was at a military ceremony commemorating the Falklands War veterans, held at St. Paul's Cathedral 2 years earlier. He had been seated in a section reserved for high-ranking officers and their families, and she recalled thinking at the time that he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. The elderly woman's discovery added a crucial piece to the puzzle, but she was uncertain what to do with the information. Approaching the authorities directly seemed presumptuous, yet she felt that someone should know that the Challenger was likely a person of military significance rather than just another difficult tourist. Margaret Foster had reached her limit of patience regarding Wellington's distress.
The horse was now actively pulling against his lead rope and showing signs of genuine agitation that could become dangerous if not addressed. She made the difficult decision to begin leading him away from the immediate area, hoping to calm him down while remaining close enough to monitor the ongoing situation. As Wellington was led away, his departure seemed to mark a symbolic shift in the confrontation. The horse had been an innocent bystander caught up in the human drama, and his removal highlighted the fact that the standoff was beginning to affect more than just the two primary participants. Thomas noticed Wellington's departure with a mixture of relief and regret. He was glad that the horse would no longer be subjected to the stress of the situation, but he also felt the loss of the animal's calming presence. In some strange way, Wellington's steady breathing and occasional soft sounds had provided a connection to normalcy during the increasingly surreal confrontation. The challenger's reaction to Wellington's departure was interesting to observe. For the first time since the standoff began, his attention briefly shifted away from Thomas to follow the horse's progress toward the stable area. There was something in his expression during that moment that suggested a personal connection to horses, or at least an appreciation for their well-being that went beyond casual interest. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows began to lengthen across the courtyard, it became clear that the situation had reached a critical juncture. The changing of the guard ceremony could not be delayed indefinitely. The crowd was becoming increasingly restless, and both primary participants were showing signs of strain despite their outward composure. The words that had started this extraordinary confrontation continued to hang in the air like a challenge that demanded resolution. "Might I have a word with you about proper protocol?" The simple question had revealed itself to be anything but simple, touching on issues of authority, tradition, duty, and respect that went to the very heart of what it meant to serve the crown. Whatever happened next would determine not only the immediate outcome of this unprecedented standoff but also set precedents for how such situations would be handled in the future. The royal courtyard had become a stage for a drama that none of the participants had anticipated, and the resolution would require wisdom, courage, and perhaps a willingness to look beyond the rigid protocols that had created the impasse in the first place. The clock hands moved inexorably toward 2 o'clock as Thomas Mackenzie found himself trapped in what had become the longest single period of duty he had ever experienced. His legs had progressed beyond mere aching to a state of numbness that was both blessing and curse. The bearskin hat that crowned his head felt as though it had doubled in weight, and the scarlet tunic that had seemed so proudly symbolic that morning now felt like a prison of wool and brass buttons. Yet none of these physical discomforts compared to the mental strain of the impossible decision he faced. The distinguished challenger had not moved from his position, had not repeated his request, had not shown any sign of impatience or frustration. He simply stood there with the calm confidence of a man who knew that time was on his side, that eventually something would have to give way. Detective Inspector Crawford had been joined by his superior, Chief Inspector Margaret Walsh, a woman whose 20-year career had included assignments to royal protection and diplomatic security. Walsh brought a different perspective to the situation, having dealt with similar incidents involving foreign dignitaries and military personnel who sometimes tested the boundaries of protocol in ways that seemed innocuous but carried deeper significance. After reviewing the surveillance footage and witness statements, Walsh had reached a conclusion that made her deeply uncomfortable. The challenger's behavior, his knowledge of military customs, his confident expectation of a response, and, most importantly, his apparent willingness to wait indefinitely, all suggested that this was not a random encounter. Someone had sent him, or he had come with a specific purpose that went beyond mere curiosity about the guard's legendary stoicism. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton had overcome her natural reluctance to involve herself in official matters and had approached one of the uniformed security officers with her identification of the challenger. The officer, initially skeptical of input from an elderly civilian, became much more interested when she provided specific details about the military ceremony where she had seen the man before. The information was quickly relayed up the chain of command, where it reached Colonel Whitmore within minutes. The colonel's reaction was immediate and telling. He recognized the description and had a very good idea of who they were dealing with. This knowledge, rather than providing relief, only increased his concern about the potential ramifications of the situation. Brigadier General Sir Reginald Ashworth, retired, was not a man to be taken lightly. A decorated veteran of 3 decades of military service, he had commanded troops in some of the most challenging conflicts of the modern era before accepting a position as military advisor to the Ministry of Defense.
More relevantly to the current situation, he was known throughout military circles as a stickler for proper protocol and had never hesitated to challenge what he perceived as lapses in standards, regardless of rank or position. The realization that they were dealing with Brigadier General Ashworth transformed the situation from an unusual tourist incident into a potential military crisis. Ashworth's presence at the palace and his specific challenge to one of the guards was almost certainly not coincidental. He had come with a purpose, and that purpose was likely related to some perceived failure in military standards or protocol. Colonel Whitmore found himself facing a dilemma that went far beyond the simple question of whether Thomas should respond to the Brigadier General's inquiry. If Ashworth had identified a genuine problem with the guard's procedures or training, ignoring his concerns could have serious consequences for the entire regiment. On the other hand, allowing a retired officer, regardless of his distinguished service record, to dictate how current operations were conducted would set a dangerous precedent. Dr. Hartwell had been monitoring the psychological dynamics of the confrontation and had noted several concerning developments. The prolonged nature of the standoff was creating stress responses in both participants that could lead to poor decision-making or even physical collapse. Thomas was showing signs of dehydration and exhaustion that his training was helping him mask but not eliminate. Ashworth, despite his apparent calm, was also experiencing stress, manifested in subtle changes to his posture and breathing patterns. More worrying was the crowd dynamic, which had evolved from curious observation to active participation. People were now openly discussing the situation, taking photographs, and even placing bets on the outcome. What had begun as a private matter between two military men was rapidly becoming a public spectacle that could damage the dignity and reputation of the monarchy itself. The afternoon changing of the guard ceremony was now less than 30 minutes away, and preparations were beginning throughout the palace complex. The relief guards were conducting their final equipment checks, the band was warming up their instruments, and tourists were positioning themselves for optimal viewing of the famous ceremony. But the standoff threatened to overshadow or even prevent the normal proceedings. Lieutenant Morrison had been tasked with developing contingency plans, but each option she considered seemed to create as many problems as it solved. Moving the ceremony to a different location would disappoint thousands of tourists and might be seen as capitulation to pressure. Proceeding as normal while ignoring the ongoing confrontation would likely result in chaos as spectators focused on the drama rather than the ceremony. Attempting to forcibly remove either participant could escalate the situation into something far more serious. Margaret Foster had managed to calm Wellington and had stabled him safely, but she found herself drawn back to observe the continuing standoff. Her years of experience with both horses and humans had given her insights into stress responses and the importance of reading body language. From her perspective, both men were approaching their limits, though they were expressing it in very different ways. Thomas was maintaining his external composure through sheer force of will and professional training, but Margaret could see the subtle signs of a man under extreme pressure. His breathing had become more controlled and deliberate, a technique used to manage stress but one that couldn't be maintained indefinitely. His hands, normally relaxed at his sides, showed tension in the fingers that suggested internal struggle. Ashworth's stress was manifested differently but was equally apparent to someone trained to observe such things. His apparent calm was undermined by small but telling details, the slight tremor in his left hand, the way he occasionally shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and, most tellingly, the tightness around his eyes that suggested he was not as confident about the outcome as he appeared. The crowd had continued to grow and had taken on characteristics of a festival atmosphere rather than the respectful observation typically associated with royal ceremonies. Vendors had appeared selling snacks and beverages, parents were lifting children onto their shoulders for better views, and someone had begun leading informal tours that highlighted the unusual nature of what was taking place. This transformation of the solemn palace grounds into something resembling a circus was particularly galling to Colonel Whitmore, who took pride in maintaining the dignity and proper atmosphere of royal ceremonies. The situation was rapidly approaching a point where intervention would be necessary simply to preserve the reputation of the institution, regardless of the underlying issues that had created the confrontation. Detective Inspector Crawford had received authorization to approach Ashworth directly and attempt to resolve the situation through diplomatic means. His instructions were to treat the Brigadier General with full respect while firmly encouraging him to conclude his demonstration and leave the area. Crawford was experienced in dealing with difficult personalities and understood that the approach would need to acknowledge Ashworth's legitimate concerns while providing him with a face-saving way to disengage. As Crawford made his way through the crowd toward Ashworth's position, he became acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes watching his every move. The spectators seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, and conversations quieted as people focused their attention on what they assumed would be the climax of the extended drama. Thomas noticed Crawford's approach through his peripheral vision and felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that someone in authority was finally taking action to resolve the impossible situation, but apprehension about what form that resolution might take. If he had failed to handle the situation properly, there could be serious consequences for his career and his future in the military. Ashworth also observed Crawford's approach with interest rather than concern. His body language suggested that he had been expecting some form of official intervention and was prepared to deal with it. This reaction reinforced the growing suspicion that his presence at the palace was not spontaneous but had been carefully planned as part of some larger purpose. Mrs. Pemberton watched the unfolding events with the satisfaction of someone whose information had proven useful, but also with growing concern about the potential consequences. She had spent enough time around the palace to understand that incidents like this could have ramifications that extended far beyond the immediate participants. The guards she had come to know and respect over the years took their duties seriously, and she worried that this young man might suffer unfairly for circumstances beyond his control. Dr. Hartwell positioned herself where she could observe the interaction between Crawford and Ashworth while continuing to monitor Thomas's condition. Her professional assessment was that the guard was approaching the limits of his physical and mental endurance. The combination of prolonged immobility, psychological pressure, and the stress of being the center of public attention was creating a situation that could result in collapse or other medical emergency if not resolved soon. The palace medical staff had been quietly alerted to the situation and were standing by in case their services were needed. While guards were trained for extended periods of ceremonial duty, the psychological pressure of the current situation was unprecedented and could lead to problems that normal training had not prepared them for. Crawford reached Ashworth's position and addressed him with the careful combination of respect and authority that his training had taught him to use with high-ranking military personnel. "Brigadier General Ashworth, sir, I'm Detective Inspector Crawford with the Metropolitan Police. Might I have a word with you privately about the current situation?" The formal recognition of his rank and the respectful tone of the approach seemed to satisfy some requirement in Ashworth's mind. For the first time since the standoff began, he turned his attention away from Thomas and acknowledged the presence of another authority figure. "Inspector Crawford, I presume you're here to ask me to conclude my business and move along?" "Sir, we're concerned about the safety and comfort of everyone involved, including yourself. The situation has attracted considerable attention, and we'd like to find a way to resolve it that respects everyone's interests and maintains appropriate dignity." Ashworth's response revealed much about his motivations and his assessment of what had transpired. "Inspector, I came here today to observe the standards of discipline and protocol maintained by Her Majesty's Guard. What I've witnessed has been exemplary. This young man has demonstrated exactly the kind of steadfast commitment to duty that the position demands." The words carried across the courtyard clearly enough for Thomas to hear, and their impact was immediate. The compliment from such a distinguished military figure was the highest form of recognition a young guard could receive, but it also confirmed what many had suspected: this had been a test rather than a genuine attempt at conversation. Crawford recognized that Ashworth had essentially declared victory and was providing everyone involved with a face-saving conclusion to the standoff. The challenge had been issued not to disrupt or embarrass, but to validate and demonstrate the quality of the guard's training and commitment. "Sir, would you be willing to conclude your observation and allow the normal ceremonial schedule to proceed?" "Certainly, Inspector. I believe I've seen everything I came to see. Please convey my compliments to Colonel Whitmore and his command on maintaining the highest standards of military bearing and discipline." As Ashworth began to move away from his position, the crowd seemed to exhale collectively, sensing that the drama was finally reaching its conclusion. But the Brigadier General had one more surprise in store. Instead of simply leaving the area, he approached Thomas directly, positioning himself at a respectful distance that acknowledged the guard's duty while allowing for communication. "Guardsman," Ashworth said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military command, "you have conducted yourself with exceptional discipline today. Your adherence to protocol in the face of unusual circumstances reflects great credit on yourself and your regiment. Well done." The formal military praise was both an acknowledgement of Thomas's performance and a signal that the test was concluded. More importantly, it provided Thomas with official permission to acknowledge the interaction without violating protocol. For the first time in over 3 hours, the young guard allowed himself a barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, finally understanding that they had witnessed something special rather than merely unusual. The extended standoff had been transformed from a potential embarrassment into a demonstration of the exceptional discipline and dedication that made the Queen's Guard legendary throughout the world. Colonel Whitmore, watching from his observation post, felt a complex mixture of relief, pride, and residual concern. The immediate crisis had been resolved successfully, with both his guard and the institution emerging with their reputations enhanced. But the incident had also highlighted potential vulnerabilities in their procedures and the need to prepare for similar challenges in the future. As the normal rhythm of palace life began to reassert itself and preparations for the changing of the guard ceremony resumed, everyone involved knew that they had participated in something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The royal standoff had ended, but its implications would continue to resonate throughout the military community and beyond. The immediate aftermath of the standoff created a peculiar atmosphere in the palace courtyard, as if everyone present was trying to process what they had just witnessed. The crowd that had gathered to watch the drama began to disperse slowly, many people lingering to discuss the events with fellow spectators or to capture final photographs of Thomas, who remained at his post despite the conclusion of his ordeal. Thomas Mackenzie found himself in a surreal state of mental and physical transition. After more than 3 hours of absolute stillness and silence, the simple act of having acknowledged Brigadier General Ashworth with that slight nod felt monumental. His body was sending conflicting signals of relief and continued tension, as if his nervous system hadn't yet received the message that the crisis had passed. The young guard's legs trembled slightly as circulation began to return to normal, and he could feel sweat cooling against his skin beneath the heavy wool uniform. But, despite the physical discomfort, Thomas experienced a profound sense of accomplishment that went beyond mere survival of an ordeal. He had been tested by one of the most respected military figures in the country and had not been found wanting. Brigadier General Ashworth moved through the crowd with the measured pace of a man who had achieved his objectives. His interaction with various palace officials and security personnel was cordial and professional, but there was an unmistakable satisfaction in his demeanor. The retired general had made his point about military standards and discipline in a way that would resonate throughout the military community for years to come. Detective Inspector Crawford accompanied Ashworth toward the palace gates, using the opportunity to better understand the motivations behind the extraordinary test. The Brigadier General was surprisingly forthcoming about his concerns regarding modern military training and his belief that the traditional values of duty and discipline were being eroded by contemporary attitudes. "Inspector," Ashworth explained as they walked, "I've been hearing disturbing reports about declining standards in various military units. Young people today are said to lack the commitment and discipline of previous generations. I wanted to see for myself whether the Queen's Guard maintained the exceptional standards that have made them famous worldwide." Crawford nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the broader implications of what had just occurred. "And your assessment, sir?" "Outstanding," Ashworth replied without hesitation. That young man demonstrated exactly the kind of unwavering dedication to duty that represents the best of British military tradition. His performance today should serve as an example to guards and soldiers throughout the service. Colonel Whitmore had left his observation post and was making his way toward Thomas's position, intending to conduct a personal debrief of the incident while the details were still fresh. His military experience had taught him the importance of immediate after-action reviews, particularly following unusual or stressful situations that might have lasting psychological effects on the personnel involved. As the colonel approached, Thomas snapped to an even more rigid position of attention, if such a thing were possible after his extended ordeal. Despite his exhaustion, military protocol demanded that he show proper respect for his commanding officer, and his training overcame his physical discomfort. At ease, Mackenzie, Whitmore said quietly, his voice carrying both authority and concern.
How are you feeling? Do you need medical attention?
I'm fine, sir, Thomas replied, though his voice carried a slight hoarseness from the hours of maintained silence.
Ready to continue with my duties as assigned.
Whitmore studied the young guard carefully, looking for signs of stress or exhaustion that might affect his performance during the upcoming changing of the guard ceremony. What he saw was fatigue, certainly, but also a quiet confidence that spoke well of Thomas's character and training. Dr. Hartwell approached the group with her assessment of the psychological impact of the extended confrontation. Her professional opinion was that Thomas had handled the stress remarkably well, but she recommended monitoring him for delayed stress reactions that sometimes manifested hours or even days after traumatic events. The human mind can process unusual stress in unexpected ways, she explained to Colonel Whitmore. While Guardsman Mackenzie appears to have coped admirably with the immediate situation, it would be wise to ensure he has access to counseling resources if needed in the coming days. Margaret Foster had returned to the courtyard after ensuring Wellington's complete recovery from the morning's stress. The experienced groom was relieved to see that the situation had been resolved without injury to anyone involved, but she remained concerned about the broader implications for the horse's daily routines. "Colonel," she said respectfully, "I hope we can develop better procedures for handling situations like this in the future. The horses are very sensitive to human tension, and prolonged stress situations can affect their behavior for days afterward."
Whitmore acknowledged her concerns with a nod.
The incident had highlighted several areas where their emergency procedures needed review and improvement. The palace operated on carefully choreographed schedules that involved not just human personnel but also the animals that played crucial roles in ceremonial functions.
Mrs.
Dorothy Pemberton had remained in the courtyard, partly out of curiosity about how the situation would conclude but also out of genuine concern for the young guard she had watched endure such an extended ordeal. As a retired teacher, she felt a maternal instinct toward young people facing difficult challenges, and she wanted to ensure that Thomas received appropriate recognition for his exceptional performance. When Colonel Whitmore noticed the elderly woman lingering nearby, he approached her with the courtesy that military officers traditionally showed to civilian supporters of the crown. "Madam, I understand you provided valuable assistance in identifying our visitor today." Mrs. Pemberton smiled modestly. "I simply recognized him from a previous ceremony, Colonel. I felt someone should know that he wasn't just an ordinary tourist causing trouble." "Your observation proved crucial to understanding the situation properly," Whitmore replied. "Please accept our gratitude for your civic-mindedness and attention to detail." The conversation highlighted one of the unexpected positive aspects of the day's events. The incident had demonstrated the value of maintaining good relationships with the regular visitors and local residents who frequented the palace grounds. Mrs. Pemberton's knowledge and willingness to share information had been instrumental in resolving the situation appropriately. Lieutenant Morrison was conducting a thorough review of the security footage and witness statements, compiling a comprehensive report that would be studied by military and security officials throughout the government. The incident would undoubtedly become a case study in military training programs, examining both the successful aspects of the response and areas where improvements could be made. The technical analysis revealed several interesting details about Ashworth's planning and execution of his test. The surveillance footage showed that he had conducted reconnaissance of the palace grounds on at least 2 previous occasions, studying the guards' routines and identifying the optimal time and location for his challenge. This level of preparation suggested that Ashworth's test had been carefully designed to create maximum stress while remaining within legal and ethical boundaries. His choice of Thomas as the subject appeared to have been based on several factors, including the guard's relative inexperience and the high visibility of his post during peak tourist hours. The changing of the guard ceremony proceeded as scheduled at 2:30 p.m., though with an unusual level of attention from the crowd that had witnessed the earlier drama. Many spectators had remained specifically to see how Thomas would perform his ceremonial duties after his extraordinary ordeal. Thomas's participation in the ceremony was flawless, his movements precise and his bearing proud. The fact that he could transition seamlessly from the stress of the standoff to the complex choreography of the guard change demonstrated both his personal resilience and the effectiveness of his training. The ceremony concluded with the traditional inspection by the duty officer, during which Thomas's equipment and appearance were scrutinized for any deviation from standard. Despite his extended ordeal, everything was found to be in perfect order, a testament to both his professionalism and his ability to maintain standards under pressure. As the relieving guard took his position and Thomas was formally released from duty, he experienced a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at finally being able to move and speak normally was accompanied by pride in having successfully met an unprecedented challenge. But there was also a strange sense of loss, as if the intensity of the experience had created a heightened state of awareness that was difficult to abandon. The debriefing session that followed involved not just Colonel Whitmore but also representatives from military intelligence and palace security. The incident had raised questions about how similar challenges might be handled in the future and what protocols needed to be developed to protect both the guards and the institution they served. Thomas's account of the experience provided valuable insights into the psychological pressures faced by guards in unusual situations. His description of the decision-making process he had gone through highlighted the complexity of balancing military discipline with the need to respond appropriately to unexpected challenges. The medical examination that followed the debriefing revealed no serious physical effects from the prolonged period of immobility, though Thomas was advised to engage in light physical activity to restore normal circulation and muscle function. The palace medical officer was particularly interested in documenting the physiological effects of extended ceremonial duty under stress conditions. News of the incident began to spread through military channels that evening, with various versions of the story circulating among guards units throughout the country. The consensus opinion was that Thomas had upheld the finest traditions of military service and that his performance reflected credit on all ceremonial guards. Brigadier General Ashworth's report to his contacts in the Ministry of Defense was unequivocally positive regarding the standards maintained by the Queen's Guard. His assessment would carry significant weight in discussions about military training and the allocation of resources to ceremonial units. The incident also attracted attention from military historians and experts in ceremonial protocol, who recognized it as a unique example of how traditional military values could be tested and validated in contemporary settings. Several academic institutions expressed interest in studying the event as part of research into military culture and tradition. As Thomas finally returned to his quarters that evening, he reflected on the day's events with a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The ordeal had been unlike anything he had experienced during his military training, but it had also provided him with a deep sense of confidence in his ability to meet whatever challenges his service might present. The young guard's performance had not only validated his own training and commitment but had also demonstrated to a watching world that the legendary discipline of the Queen's Guard remained as strong as ever. In an age of rapid change and shifting values, his unwavering adherence to duty had provided a reassuring demonstration of continuity and tradition. The royal standoff had ended with honor intact for all participants, but its effects would continue to ripple through the military community and beyond. Thomas Mackenzie had entered the day as a promising young guard. He would emerge from it as a symbol of everything that the Queen's Guard represented at its finest. 6 months after the extraordinary standoff in the palace courtyard, the ripple effects of that October day continued to be felt throughout the British military establishment and beyond. What had begun as a simple test of protocol had evolved into something much more significant, a defining moment that reshaped how the military thought about tradition, discipline, and the role of ceremonial duties in modern society. Thomas Mackenzie had been promoted to Lance Corporal, a recognition that came earlier than usual and was directly attributed to his exceptional performance during what had become known throughout the regiment as the Ashworth Incident. The promotion brought new responsibilities and challenges, but also a level of respect from his peers that he had never experienced before. The young guard had been selected to participate in several high-profile ceremonial events following his promotion, including a state visit by the President of France and the Queen's birthday parade. His commanding officers viewed him as a reliable performer who could be trusted to maintain standards even under unusual pressure, a reputation that had opened doors to opportunities within the military that he had never imagined possible. But the incident had also brought unexpected challenges. Thomas found himself something of a celebrity within military circles, a status that sometimes made his colleagues treat him differently than they had before. Some viewed him with increased respect and admiration, while others seemed to resent the attention he had received for simply doing his duty as he had been trained to do. Dr. Hartwell had continued to monitor Thomas's psychological adjustment in the months following the incident, conducting periodic interviews to assess any long-term effects of the extended stress situation. Her findings had been largely positive, showing that he had processed the experience in a healthy way and had actually gained confidence from having successfully met such an unusual challenge. The incident appears to have served as a form of validation for his training and his personal commitment to military service, Dr. Hartwell noted in her final report. Rather than creating trauma or anxiety, the successful resolution of the situation has strengthened his sense of professional identity and his confidence in his ability to handle difficult situations. The psychological study had broader implications for understanding how military personnel responded to unexpected challenges and stressful situations. The findings contributed to revisions in training programs throughout the armed forces, with increased emphasis on preparing soldiers for scenarios that fell outside normal operational parameters. Colonel Whitmore had used the incident as an opportunity to conduct a comprehensive review of palace security and ceremonial procedures. The analysis had revealed several areas where protocols could be improved to better handle unusual situations while maintaining the dignity and traditions that were central to the Queen's Guard's mission. New procedures had been developed for identifying and responding to challenges from individuals with military backgrounds or official credentials. These protocols provided guards with clearer guidance on when and how to request assistance while maintaining their ceremonial responsibilities, reducing the likelihood that individual guards would find themselves in impossible situations like the one Thomas had faced. The training program for new guards had been expanded to include scenarios based on the Ashworth incident, helping prepare future guards for the possibility of encountering similar challenges. The exercises emphasized the importance of maintaining discipline while also developing the judgment necessary to recognize when situations required additional support or intervention. Brigadier General Ashworth had become something of a folk hero within certain military circles, praised for his creative approach to testing and validating military standards. His method had demonstrated that it was possible to conduct meaningful assessments of military discipline without resorting to formal inspections or punitive measures. The retired general had been invited to speak at several military academies and training institutions about his philosophy regarding military standards and the importance of maintaining traditional values in modern military service. His presentations consistently emphasized the role that individual character and personal commitment played in maintaining the effectiveness of military organizations. Young Mackenzie's performance that day demonstrated something that cannot be taught through classroom instruction or field exercises, Ashworth would tell his audiences. It showed the kind of inner strength and commitment to duty that separates truly exceptional soldiers from those who are merely competent. That quality cannot be manufactured or mandated, it must come from within. The academic and historical community had also taken note of the incident, with several scholars writing papers analyzing its significance in the context of military tradition and ceremonial protocol. The standoff had been characterized as a unique intersection of past and present, where ancient traditions of military discipline were tested and validated in a contemporary setting. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton had been invited to participate in several oral history projects documenting the incident, and her perspective as a civilian witness had provided valuable insights into how the public perceived and understood military traditions. Her detailed recollections had helped historians piece together a complete picture of the day's events and their broader significance. The elderly woman had also been formally recognized by the palace administration for her assistance in identifying Brigadier General Ashworth, receiving a personal letter of thanks that she treasured among her most prized possessions. The recognition had validated her years of informal support for the palace guards and had encouraged other regular visitors to take a more active interest in supporting the institution. Margaret Foster had implemented new protocols for managing the horses during unusual incidents, ensuring that the animals' welfare would be protected even during extended disruptions to their normal routines. The procedures included provisions for temporary relocation of horses if necessary and better communication between grooms and security personnel during developing situations. Wellington, the horse who had been present during the early stages of the standoff, had returned to normal service without any lasting effects from the stress of that day.
The intelligent animal had continued to serve in ceremonial functions and had even been specifically requested for several high-profile events, his calm demeanor under pressure having been noted by palace officials. The media coverage of the incident had been generally positive, with most outlets focusing on the demonstration of military discipline and tradition rather than on any negative aspects of the confrontation. Several documentaries had been produced examining the role of the Queen's Guard in British culture and the challenges of maintaining ancient traditions in the modern world. International media had also taken interest in the story, with military traditions experts from around the world commenting on the significance of the incident for understanding how ceremonial units maintained their standards. The story had been particularly well received in countries with similar military traditions, where it was seen as validation of the continued relevance of ceremonial duties. The incident had also prompted discussions within the Ministry of Defense about the broader role of ceremonial units in contemporary military structure. While some officials questioned the resources devoted to purely ceremonial functions, the Ashworth incident had provided compelling evidence of the value these units provided in maintaining military traditions and public confidence in military institutions. Thomas Mackenzie had been invited to share his experiences with new recruits joining the Queen's Guard, helping to prepare them for the realities of ceremonial duty. His presentations emphasized not just the technical aspects of guard duty but also the mental preparation necessary to handle unexpected challenges while maintaining professional standards. "The most important thing I learned that day," Thomas would tell the recruits, was that all our training and preparation was not just about following procedures mechanically. It was about developing the character and judgment necessary to uphold the honor of the Guard even when faced with situations we had never encountered before. The young NCO had also been selected for advanced leadership training, with his superiors recognizing that his experience during the standoff had demonstrated qualities that made him suitable for greater responsibilities. The training would prepare him for eventual promotion to senior non-commissioned officer ranks, where his experience could benefit future generations of guards. Detective Inspector Crawford had incorporated lessons learned from the incident into training programs for police officers assigned to royal protection duties. The importance of recognizing when civilian law enforcement should defer to military protocol had been highlighted as a crucial skill for officers working in environments where both systems operated simultaneously. The detective had also developed better procedures for coordinating between police and military personnel during unusual incidents, ensuring that both organizations could work together effectively while respecting each other's areas of responsibility and expertise. Dr. Hartwell's research into the psychological aspects of the incident had contributed to broader studies of stress response and resilience in high-pressure occupations. Her findings had applications not just for military personnel but also for police officers, firefighters, and other professionals who might face similar challenges in maintaining composure under difficult circumstances. The incident had also influenced discussions about the role of tradition and ceremony in maintaining organizational culture and morale. Several corporations and institutions had studied the Queen's Guard model as an example of how ceremonial elements could reinforce organizational values and create a sense of shared identity among personnel. As the anniversary of the standoff approached, plans were being made to commemorate the incident in various ways. The regiment was considering establishing an annual award recognizing exceptional performance under pressure, to be named in honor of the incident. Military historians were compiling a comprehensive record of the events for inclusion in official regimental histories. Thomas Mackenzie, now a seasoned NCO with additional responsibilities and recognition, often reflected on how that single day had changed the trajectory of his military career. The ordeal that had seemed impossible to endure at the time had ultimately become one of the most defining and positive experiences of his service. The young man who had stood frozen in the palace courtyard, wrestling with an impossible decision about protocol and duty, had emerged as a symbol of everything the Queen's Guard represented at its finest. His unwavering commitment to duty, even in the face of unprecedented challenges, had not only validated his own training but had also demonstrated to the world that the legendary discipline of the British military remained as strong as ever. The royal standoff had ended exactly as it should have, with honor intact for all participants and with the traditions of the Queen's Guard strengthened rather than diminished by the test they had endured. In an age of rapid change and shifting values, the incident had provided a reassuring demonstration that some things remained constant, that duty and discipline still meant something,
and that young people were still capable of rising to meet the highest standards of service. The words that had frozen the courtyard that October day, "Might I have a word with you about proper protocol?" had ultimately become a validation of everything the Queen's Guard stood for. The standoff was over, but its legacy would continue to inspire and instruct future generations of soldiers who understood that true military service meant being ready to face any challenge while upholding the highest traditions of honor, duty, and commitment to the crown.